There are plenty of image editing tools and techniques that, when used in the wrong context, can lead to a messy disaster in your photo, and you may not know where you went wrong. Every week I see maybe a dozen or so images that have suffered from these exact mistakes, and they stand out to me because I've made each of these mistakes at some point in my photography journey. What's important is that we identify what's happening, what problem is being created, and then how to avoid it in the future. And that's exactly what I want to talk about today. I've got 6 editing mistakes that I see photographers make all the time, and I want to show you what they are and how to avoid them. One of the mistakes I see a lot of photographers do is adding contrast to their image no matter what. To give you an example of this in one of my own images, this is one that I took a few years ago just north of the town of Banff. And you can tell that it has a lot of contrast in it already, sort of globally. You can see that the sky and the reflection of the sky are very bright, and the midground here is very dark with these sort of trees. But if I wanted to get a little bit more definition, a little more detail in the sky and in these mountains, I might go and grab my contrast slider and then just start adding a little bit of contrast to see if I can bring out those mountains a little bit more. And actually you can see, if you compare this to no contrast to full contrast, you can see that you've actually lost a whole bunch of detail in the sky. It's now just pure white, and the mountains haven't gotten any clearer to sort of look at. Actually, what this photo needs is actually to reduce the contrast overall. And you can see in the final edit that I did, it's really not particularly very bright in the sky or the reflection, but it balances a little bit better with that midground, and you can really see the mountain and obviously the reflection of the mountain a little bit better, and you've got more sort of clouds in the sky. You've got a little more detail up there. And what I did here was remove a bunch of contrast from this image to actually bring out more of the detail. In another sort of similar example, this is a photo that I think I probably would have just thrown this away, but I did a little bit of editing to it and I sort of brought it back. This image was at Hilton Falls. Obviously you can tell it's a very bright day and you've got this dappled light kind of coming through the trees there. But again, this photo, if you were to actually remove a bunch of contrast from it, you can see that there's a lot of detail in these roots. Now, in the final edit that I did, I've sort of cropped and I've really done quite a lot of work to this, added a bit of atmospherics, all these other things, but one of the things that I've done is removed a bunch of that contrast that was there in the original raw file. So frequently photographers will aim for more contrast in the photo and assume that by adding contrast via the contrast slider or any other method will be a good thing for their photos. But there's a difference between what your eye sees in a photo and what the digital representation of it is. Sometimes adding contrast to an image has the opposite effect to your eye, doesn't let you see as much in the photo. Oftentimes when you take a photo of sunrise or sunset, you end up with a photo that's got a ton of dynamic range, meaning that there are very dark parts of the image and very bright parts of the image. And oftentimes what I see photographers do is sort of try to compress that so that the brights aren't so bright and the darks aren't so dark. Because oftentimes the mood of an image includes parts that are too bright and too dark to have any detail. So I've got an example here of a very silhouetted CN tower with a beautiful red sunrise behind it. And in photos like this, I do see a lot of photographers who will look at this silhouette. It could be a cityscape, it could be trees, and they say, you know what, that just looks too dark. So I might go ahead and just like up my shadows and up my blacks in order to get a little bit more definition. Look, now I can see these buildings in the front that weren't really visible before. But what I've really done is just created this like haze in the photo, and I've reduced a lot of the contrast, which I don't really like. In the final edit of this photo, I think I actually darkened the skyline and sharpened it a little bit and even brightened the sky so that I could get even more color and even more sort of brightness. It really shows off that when you're standing and looking at this type of scene, the light is extremely bright and extremely dark in different conditions, and I really wanted to accentuate that. On another example, again, another sunrise, this is Burley Falls. In the final edit, what I ended up with was actually that the sun and the sky around it is very, very bright. And I've sort of brightened up all these different elements to really give you this idea of the sun just kind of blasting in this scene and really lighting up this waterfall and all the rocks and trees and things around it. Looking at these two photos, I've sort of done a high key and a low key, right? Like this one is quite bright and the sky is really quite too much. And in the other one, the CN tower is really too dark to be able to make out any details except for its silhouette. A few years ago, Adobe added this dehaze tool to Lightroom, and I saw a lot of photographers using it. But one of the unintended consequences of using that dehaze tool was actually removing a lot of depth from those images. Because oftentimes that haze, or the sort of layers of haze in the atmosphere, are one of the visual cues that your eye sees in order to understand, the distance and how deep an image is. So in this example, a photo that I took of Sulphur Mountain kind of begins with a lot of atmospheric haze. And you can see that not only that, but there's a bit of smoke rising up from this mountain, obviously sort of a lot going on in the atmosphere. So you might then go and grab this dehaze slider and say, oh yeah, I want to dehaze this because I want to bring out some of the, some of the details. But what you end up with is that you've lost a little bit of the scene. You've lost a little bit of what that scene really was. And I have found that going the opposite direction and actually adding back a bit of haze really makes this photo a lot more interesting. And it really adds a lot more to the atmosphere again of what this photo is and what the scene was like. And in another example of this, here's a photo that I took at Killarney Provincial Park. And when we reached the top of this ridge, this granite ridge, a big snowstorm started, and all the photos that I wanted to take with this long lens really sort of went away. So I was able to catch this image of, all the layers of sort of trees and mountain in the background. And you can't really see all these different things. So it might be obvious to take the dehaze slider and sort of take that up. But actually now there's like less snowstorm all of a sudden. In the edit that I finally did, you can see that there's lots and lots of different layers in this photo, but you really get a good idea that like the snow and the storm is really what's creating these layers and sort of separating this image visually. So sometimes even though you've got a little bit of haze in your photo, you might want to leave that alone or really sort of add a little bit of haze in order to add a little more atmosphere. Oftentimes your brain will tell you there's something wrong with a photo. You don't entirely know exactly what it is. One of the things that I see very frequently is where a photographer has really lightened the foreground way too much. I see this a lot with wide angle shots where photographers are trying to showcase the foregrounds that they've gotten close to, and they might brighten that foreground and make it even brighter than the sky, which your brain looks at and says, well, there's something wrong here. In this example here from Tobermory, you can see that it sort of starts out pretty dark, and definitely the foreground is a little dark. So a lot of photographers, what they'll do is first sort of take that exposure up, but then they may also sort of mask out the foreground a little, just do this very quickly, and then say, well, I want to see that a little bit more, so I'm going to sort of take up the exposure. And yes, if you just look at that one part of the image, you can see that there's a lot more detail and it's much more interesting. But when you look at it compared to the rest of the image, it sort of looks off a little bit because, of course, if the sun is only lighting, the sky and this lighthouse a little bit, it's not going to be brightening this foreground so much. In the final edit that I did, the foreground is, of course, much darker, but actually you can almost make out that I've kind of added a gradient right at the bottom here and then darkened it so that I'm getting lots of detail here, but this dark element isn't particularly interesting, and so your eye is sort of pushed up through the photo until you sort of get to the lighthouse in the sky. And so I've kind of sacrificed this foreground element, but the photo overall is better because of it. One of the very first editing tips that I remember receiving was to add an S-curve. And I didn't know what that meant, and I applied it to a couple of my photos, and I thought I was doing really great things with them. When I look back on those photos, they sucked. So if I wanted to add an S-curve to this photo here, I would go into this tone curve adjustment tool. I would grab the sort of lower part of this and pull it down, and I would grab the higher part of it and sort of pull it up. And the idea is that this is adding a lot of contrast to your photo. But maybe I've selected the wrong parts of this. Now it's even darker and sort of harder to see, and it's definitely like crunchy, but it isn't particularly nice to look at. If I wanted to use the tone curve tool with a little more intention, what I would actually use is this tool over here. So you click on this and it allows you to grab points of the image, and then if you pull them down, they get darker. If you pull them up, they get brighter. And this allows you to really select the parts of the image that you want to adjust. If you end up with an S-curve, that's great. If you don't end up with an S-curve, maybe even better. I would probably in this image pull the shadows up a little bit and pull some of the highlights down a little bit to sort of reduce the contrast but make it a little more visible. The tone curve tool is actually really easy and simple to use once you get an idea of what it does, but simply going in and adding an S-curve doesn't really do anything to your photo other than change the contrast in a way that might not work for you. If you're very excited to edit an image, it'll be very easy to rush through it and get the thing on social media as fast as you possibly can. This photo here took me an incredibly long time to edit because I left space in between some of the changes that I made. Oftentimes happens to me with color or different parts of contrast in the image where I try to make the edits and my eyes maybe adjust to the image, and if I don't step away for half an hour or so and come back to it, I'll end up sort of taking the image a little too extreme. So I see this oftentimes when people have messed up color or they've messed up exposure or something else in their image where probably what they needed was just a little bit of a break. So that's sort of what I do. Oftentimes I will just step away for 15 minutes, probably 30 minutes is better. And then when I come back to an image, the very first thing that comes into my mind about it, like this is too blue, this is too purple, this doesn't look right, I'll make that change right away. Your eye becomes familiar with the thing that you're looking at, and it becomes challenging for you to really look at it objectively and get a good idea of maybe some of the mistakes that you've made. So I'll often see photos that have this mistake, and one of the things I think is not only did they just make this mistake, but they were unable to recognize it. And the best way to recognize it is to come back to it with fresh eyes. Well, that's it for me. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.